Welcome back to 25 Days of Actress. This month I'll be talking about 25 performances by 25 actresses in 25 films for people who don't consume a ton of holiday content. You'll get context, my thoughts, and anything that might be good to know if you'd like to watch any of these films yourself. If you want to know a little more about the series and how I picked these films, check out part 1. The link is in the description, along with links to where you can watch everything I talk about today. I've loved hearing your reviews of the films I talked about last week, so be sure to tag me on social if you have any thoughts. So without further ado, here are days 6 through 15. The Blue Angel follows a conservative professor who scolds his students for having racy photos of a cabaret singer at school. That night, he goes to the club, the Blue Angel, and tries to catch them where they aren't supposed to be. But of course, when he sees Lola, Marlene Dietrich, perform, he instantly falls in love with her and eventually resigns from teaching to marry her. His personality clashes with the cabaret lifestyle, and things escalate from there. Okay, so when I was introducing this series, I told you that these performances weren't necessarily my 25 favorite performances. Well, this actually is. The Blue Angel is probably the most important film in the Marlene Dietrich canon, for several reasons. It marked her first foray into feature-length sound films, it gave her her most iconic song, Falling in Love Again, it captured the attention of the American studios, which eventually allowed her to leave Germany at a critical juncture in that country's history, and was her first collaboration with director Joseph von Sternberg, who influenced key elements in her persona and helmed her most successful pictures in the United States, such as Shanghai Express and Blonde Venus. In The Blue Angel, we basically see her character Lola in two contexts, on stage and in her private interactions with the professor. Both have a flavor that I once read described as sensual lethargy, which is probably the best way to put it. She doesn't physically do much on stage, she just kind of sways and sits, even while singing, but she also doesn't really have to. Marlene Dietrich can alter the energy of a room just by half smiling with the corner of her mouth. Where you might remember the notes hit by Barbra Streisand or the emotion of Judy Garland, a Dietrich performance will leave you with the image of her holding her knee and leaning on a barrel. It's simple but effective, an inexplicably yet understandably durable moment that still makes its way into ads and tributes. Backstage, Marlene brilliantly translates Lola's evolving opinions on the professor. His naivete and protectiveness may be endearing at first, but qualities like that have a real shelf life, especially for a woman who is constantly on the road and swarmed with admirers. She can be playful, but she will also snap if he tries to impose his lifestyle on her, or when his pretentiousness gets out of hand. Marlene Dietrich doesn't really get enough credit for how funny she is in this performance, and you can absolutely see why studios were eager to recruit her. Basically, I have to stop myself from talking about this because I could for another hour, but there are a few good things to know going in. Things really pick up when they actually get to the cabaret, so don't give up on it if the first couple of minutes seem kind of slow to you. This film also stars the first Best Actor winner ever, Emil Jannings, who was awful on set and eventually became a favorite of the Nazis, so absolutely f*** that guy. Oh, and this was filmed in both English and German. Marlene was cast in part because she could speak both. But I don't think the English version is available, and my sense is that the German version is considered way better anyway, so stick with that one. An adaptation of The Informer by Irish novelist Liam O'Flaherty, Uptight follows a group of black militants who are betrayed by one of their members as the police investigate a robbery. I spoke about this film a bit in my video about The Help, but guess what? I'm still not done trying to get everybody to watch it, not only because it's beautifully performed and gorgeously written, but also because, sadly, it feels timely as the United States continues to grapple with racial injustice. The film reflects an inter-movement dialogue about how to achieve equality in light of the death of Martin Luther King Jr. What can peaceful movements really do if its leaders are continually murdered? I wanted to highlight Ruby Dee's work in this film specifically because she is absolutely formative to its DNA. As a co-writer of the screenplay, she injects questions that were no doubt part of her extensive experience as an activist. A member of the SCLC and the NAACP, Dee picketed Broadway theaters for not hiring black actors, she emceed the March on Washington, raised money for the Black Panthers, protested HUAC, pressured banks to give more business loans in Harlem, and more. Her intelligence, frustration, and political experience give this film palpable weight, even when she isn't on screen. And admittedly, Ruby Dee doesn't have a ton of screen time in this film. Her role primarily fills out the personal life of the main character, Tank, played by Julian Mayfield. She serves as his counselor, friend, lover. One scene depicts Tank turning to her in a moment of desperation. She is more than distraught by his grave mistake, but simultaneously must mourn losing someone she loves to the consequences he'll likely face. It's a touching, tragic scene that forecasts a difficult end to their story. Luckily, there's a great version of this thought-provoking and thrilling film on YouTube, so it's super easy to access this wonderful, wonderful work from Ruby Dee. Here's the letterboxd summary of Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown. Peppa, Carmen MAURA, resolves to kill herself with a batch of sleeping pill-laced gazpacho after her lover leaves her. Fortunately, she's interrupted by a deliciously chaotic series of events. That description, though extremely unspecific, may be the only satisfactory way to summarize this film. How else can you describe a comedy that includes setting a mattress on fire, accidentally sleeping with a terrorist, a Joan Crawford reference, throwing multiple objects out the window, drugging policemen, and even Antonio Banderas looking like an influencer? And hey, it even became a musical starring Patti LuPone. Sounds deliciously chaotic to me. Women on the Verge falls into a long line of women-centered films from Spanish director Pedro Almodovar. So many, in fact, there is an actual term for his most frequent female collaborators, Chicas Almodovar. Carmen MAURA is one, having starred in several of his films including What Have I Done to Deserve This?, Matador, and Dark Habits. In farcical comedies like Women on the Verge, there is every opportunity to overreact. Carmen doesn't. She formidably anchors this film, not with outrageous theatricality, but with earnestness. Peppa may be glued to her phone waiting for a man to call her back, but in the hands of Carmen MAURA, she is anything but a caricature.
Y que yo cuando hago una comedia no me planteo es una comedia, jeje, voy a hacer reír. No, yo me tomo la historia muy en serio. Pero en el rodaje, si yo hago una cosa que incluso que el equipo se ríe, tú me verás a mí, sería como porque la mejor cosa para hacer comedia es hacerlo muy seriamente.
In Almodovar's world of bright pinks, cherry reds, and campy 80s jewelry, she absorbs the chaos around her, sometimes succumbing to it and other times overcoming it. Tired, but too engaged to really stop herself, she becomes sidetracked again and again, unraveling unknowns about the relationships in her life and slowly allowing herself to realize that the man she wanted may never have been worthy of her in the first place. Women on the Verge gave both director and actress international exposure, and even earned a Best Foreign Language Film Oscar nomination. If you watch it, you'll definitely understand why. In Random Harvest, a World War I veteran suffering from amnesia, yes, it's an amnesia plot, falls in love with a singer-dancer named Paula, GREER Garson. Years into their married life, another injury restores all of his memories from before the war, but erases everything that came after. So, no more Paula. When he fails to return home one night, she sets out to find him and to restart their life together. Two things. One, I have never had to summarize this movie out loud before, and I'm laughing at how insane that description sounds. It's melodramatic for sure, but I promise it's not as silly as the straight-up summary I just read out makes it seem. And two, yes, I am once again asking you to watch a GREER Garson movie. It's always surprising to me how few people know her work, partly because she was incredibly famous and partly because she's extraordinarily charismatic. Random Harvest is at its core a romance, so there are plenty of opportunities for her to show that off. The benefit of her charisma here is that it fosters the kind of empathy that heightens every emotion in the film. You begin on a positive note, swept up in her charm, so happy that she's happy, and then the screenplay completely pulls the rug out from under you, and the tragedies hit twice as hard. It will tug at your heartstrings. You absolutely do not want to see a woman with that laugh holding back tears, so you continue to root for her and cross your fingers that everything will work out in the end. Random Harvest came out shortly after Mrs. Miniver, for which she won her Oscar and which was an enormous success. My video about this win explains in depth what that performance meant to Americans at the onset of World War II, so check that out for more info on that. Naturally, Random Harvest received less attention that year than Mrs. Miniver, but it still did really well and has since, I think, become somewhat of a classic film fan gem. I think it's a great introduction to her work in general in case you want to check her out for the first time. In 1977's Desperate Living, a rich, neurotic housewife named Peggy, played by Mink enlists her maid to smother her husband to death. On the run from the law, they end up in Mortville, a shantytown community populated by society's misfits and ruled by the tyrannical Queen Carlotta. So if you're going to choose a movie from this list to watch with your family, this would not be it. Known as the Pope of Trash, director John Waters relishes in things that the term pearl clutching was invented to describe. A true pioneer of cult and independent cinema, Waters lampoons American culture by elevating the kinds of people our society is too eager to hide away. His muses are unconventional, and at his best, he doesn't dare to use them conventionally. As he puts it, you have to have good taste to have good bad taste. Waters' early work solely cast friends, locals, and neighbors, all amateur actors. And Mink has been a regular through it all, from films shot on one camera at his parents' house to studio films with relatively substantial budgets. Writer Alex Halberstadt recently pointed out, and I agree, that you're likely to find parallels between this wacky-ass movie and the weird hell that we've been living in for the past few years. Mortville suffers under a leader interested primarily in accumulating her own wealth, a totalitarian who takes every opportunity to, hilariously, condescend her populace. And then there's Peggy. The first 10 minutes of this movie consist of Mink threatening to call the police on children because they accidentally broke her window. It's an absolutely hilarious, out of control, paranoid, unhinged, Karen-esque breakdown.
It's like war! Don't tell me I don't know what Vietnam is like!
When in Mortville, she allies herself with, who else? Queen Carlotta, and parodies a familiar brand of suburbanite.
Dealing with the poor people is a waste of time! Only the rich should be allowed to live!
Even a town of outcasts and filth cannot escape the superiority fantasies of the wealthy. I really enjoy John Waters' sense of humor, the way he teases American society without taking anything too seriously, and Mink contributions are absolutely crucial to seeing that vision through. Desperate Living doesn't shock quite as much as some of his other films, which include but are not limited to scenes like getting raped by a giant lobster and eating actual dog shit, but if you're worried about not jiving with his sense of humor, give the plot a quick look through on Wikipedia before you get started. In Design for Living, a young woman, Miriam Hopkins, meets two young men on a train to Paris. They become friends and eventually both fall in love with her, and she falls in love with both of them. She suggests, rather than choosing one, that they all live together platonically as friends. This, of course, does not work, and antics ensue. Design for Living has a very familiar theme. Love triangles are the backbone of classic cinema, but ends on a very unfamiliar note. Which is to say, I can't think of many classic films that almost explicitly end with a throuple, or at the very least, a threesome. Like, it's not subtle, and you might be surprised by how forthright this film is about this dynamic in general. All of this was possible thanks to the wonderful gift of timing. The film was released in 1933 during the pre-code era, when restrictions on what you could and couldn't depict/discuss in films were relatively lax. So from 1930-ish to 1934-ish, you get a lot more movies with relatively more risque themes. which happened to fall squarely in Miriam Hopkins' wheelhouse. Her films from this era, a very strong streak in her career, cast her primarily in sexually mature roles, from Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde to The Story of Temple Drake. This film, given the famous touch of sophisticated humor by Ernst Lubitsch, best demonstrates that specific pre-code flair of Miriam's. Her impulsivity reads not as recklessness, but as independence and whimsy. She delivers her dialogue at an almost manic pace, sweeping others along for the ride. Most refreshingly, the screenplay never demonizes her character. She calls the terms of the relationship. Her agency is never a secondary consideration. It's a very fun, compelling performance, and you have to admire a woman who answers an either-or question with
¿Por qué no los dos?
In Foxy Brown, Pam Grier, as Foxy Brown, infiltrates a prostitution ring to investigate the murder of her boyfriend and get revenge on his killers. In the years since its 1974 release, Foxy Brown has become something of a symbol of female empowerment, and it's not difficult to see why. Pam Grier is a tour de force in this film. While not playing a consistent individual from one film to the other, Pam Grier's films from the early 1970s give her similar roles. Coffee, Sheba Baby, and Friday Foster, for example, all characterize her as some kind of investigator, a woman in dogged pursuit of revenge. Her confident stride and focused gaze channel these characters' competence. They may be down briefly, but they are never out. We've limited the definition of action heroes to women who have superpowers or defeat giant monsters or fly through space, to women who more or less conform with easy notions of right and wrong. To me, Foxy's journey to dismantle a crime ring, her resilience against seemingly impossible odds, and the genuinely perfect way she totes a gun make her just as deserving of all the attention we've given some of these other women. I mean, who doesn't want to be like Foxy? She's smarter than you, hotter than you, and she'll hit you with a car if you mess with her family.
Before you start talking tough, I better warn you, I got a black belt in karate.
12 seconds later.
And I got my black belt in bar stools.
I guess the main difference is Foxy Brown is not kid-friendly. A classic in the blaxploitation genre, the film doesn't shy away from nudity, drugs, and contains some racial slurs, but not a Tarantino amount of racial slurs. This movie is a ton of fun, a wild ride from start to finish, and if you're not sold by the opening credits alone, well, I don't even know what to tell you. The Garden of Women takes place in an all-girls boarding school where the students, frustrated by the school's antiquated and repressive rules, are on the verge of rebellion. Among the many unhappy students is Hideko Takamine's character, who plays a student struggling to keep up, despite working diligently on her studies. Miyako Takamine, no relation, plays the strict administrator who stubbornly refuses to make any accommodations to help her succeed. Increasingly driven by the staff's lack of empathy, the student body organizes and makes demands for a more hospitable learning environment. So I've been binging the work of Japanese director Mikio Naruza, which led me separately to Mieko in Wife and Hideko in When a Woman Ascends the Stairs. While The Garden of Women isn't directed by Naruza, it's directed by Kinoshita, and is probably a more obscure choice in either of the actresses' filmographies. I chose it because A, this is a great opportunity to see both of them at work, often off of each other, and B, because this movie unexpectedly stuck with me for a long time after I watched it. Something you'll see in The Garden of Women that extends throughout Hideko Takamine's work is how adept she is at translating suffering. Many of her films place her at the center of cultural clashes in post-war Japan, women who instinctively crave more flexibility out of life, but who don't necessarily have the freedom to do anything other than adapt to whatever situation they find themselves in. Hideko can convey the entirety of this internal strife through a simple glance. In The Garden of Women, she begins there with the stressed focus, and slowly ratchets up her performance as the film progresses, until finally she unleashes a whirlwind of emotion. Miyako Takamine plays the opposite. She is stoic to a fault, and reigns over her students without exception. She guards herself from betraying any sense of vulnerability, seemingly aware that the chessboard may be falling out of her favor. Her meanness in this film is captivating, even more so because it seems so far off from her other roles. My access to her work has been limited, so take this with a grain of salt, and don't get me started on how bad international film access is. But nearly everything else I've seen her in has cast her in a much more sympathetic light. Mysterious and isolated in The Masseurs and a Woman, run ragged and fighting to hold her family together in Wife, and desperate to reunite with her lover in The 47 Ronin. The ensemble fills out with other students, each taking their own risks and testing her own limits. It was really interesting to me to get a sense of their personalities as they all interact with each other and strive for a better learning environment. This one might be harder to find, but it is available on the Criterion channel if you have a subscription to that. Hopefully we can get some more eyes on this underseen movie. Set on the verge of the new millennium, Strange Days tells the story of Lenny Nero, an ex-cop now involved in the illicit creation and dealing of data discs containing recorded memories and emotions. One day, he receives a disc which contains the memories of a murder. His investigation pulls him deeper into the world of violence, ultimately revealing the crimes of the LAPD against an anti-police activist and artist. Following her Oscar-nominated role as Tina Turner in What's Love Got to Do With It, Angela Bassett took on the role of Mace, a bodyguard, driver, and friend of Nero, who accompanies him throughout his adventure and kicks a lot of ass. She's in a supporting role, but every time she's on screen, your eyes are on her, and you'll probably end up wishing she was in it more often. Angela Bassett is uncompromising. Nobody can or ever will get in her way. Move and bow down. And yet she is the film's disciplined maternal center, guiding Nero back to reality when it becomes difficult to distinguish from his discs. The film boasts both Ralph Fiennes' truly horrid American accent and technically impressive point-of-view sequences that serve as crucial pieces to the film's puzzle. Despite its technical prowess, the film didn't do very well at the box office and was briefly considered to have ruined its director's career. Kathryn Bigelow directed this film, by the way, a good hint to its tone, which is unrelentingly gritty. There's one scene of sexual violence, but other than that, it pretty much adheres to the standards of an average action movie. After a stressful film like Strange Days, it's nice to turn to something measurably sweeter. Desert Hearts takes place in the 1950s, the days when you could get a quick divorce by establishing residency in Nevada. That's where literature professor Vivian heads when her own marriage falls apart. At the ranch where she's staying, she meets a local woman named Kay. The two become friends, and then eventually more than friends. At this point, it seems like every white straight woman in Hollywood has or is about to play a queer character. In 2020, these stories are much more visible, and the conservative minority who opposes them shrinks every year. That was not the case for Helen Shaver and Patricia Charbonneau, who played lesbians in the mid-1980s when homophobia was really doing some of its best work. Director Donna Deitch told BuzzFeed that plenty of agents didn't want their clients to be in the film, thinking it would destroy their careers. Even Patricia's agent told her this would be the last movie she'd ever make. But in the end, it all worked out. She chose to do it anyway. She and Helen fully committed themselves and delivered stunning performances. As Kay, she is undeterred by fear and unwilling to sacrifice her dignity by conforming. As Vivian, Helen moves beyond her reservations to encounter a new part of her identity. Despite its 1985 release date, parts of Desert Hearts still feel refreshing in the context of mainstream LGBTQ movies. Carol received praise for having an ending that left both women alive and relatively happy. While not to spoil anything, but Desert Hearts has a great ending too, and where Happiest Season centered a coming out narrative for what feels like the 8 millionth time, Desert Hearts unavoidably has its reveal moments, but it's not necessarily about what we think of as coming out. But undeniably, part of the reason this film works so well is because of the chemistry of the two leads. Those are my performances for today. Be sure to turn on notifications so you can be alerted when I publish the next one. Thanks for watching!